Today's video is about the Dunner morph. Let's get into it. What's up, YouTube? So Dunners are by far one of my favorite morphs in Bearded Dragons. The second, I don't know. I think first is probably Leatherback, second being Dunner. They're probably real close, but I think Leatherback enhances the Dunner, so it makes it look better. But that's besides the point. But Dunner is one of my favorite morphs in Bearded Dragons. The thing about Dunners is they have some complications, and it's caused by the breeding that was done. Now, the breeding that was done wasn't necessarily bad breeding. It was line bred, just like everything else, just to figure out what it is: incomplete dominant, recessive dominant. So they figured that out, but then they started realizing that these bearded dragons were having complications because of the mutation, the morph, and essentially that's what happened. So what are the complications that were happening? Bearded dragons, whenever they eat food, they store it in their throat before they swallow it into their stomach. This doesn't necessarily take a very long time, but with Dunners, they seem to do it longer than usual. And back then, this was happening so often and for such a long period of time that the Dunners, the bearded dragon, the Dunners, were actually getting infections, whether it be respiratory infections or just mouth rot and everything, based off them holding their food in their throat for so long. Typically, bearded dragons don't hold their food for more than 30 minutes. That's because they stuff their mouth and then they have to slowly digest it into their stomach, and that's normal. Dunners can hold it for longer than that now, but before it was even longer, overnight essentially, and that was where the problem was. There was no heat, nothing digesting. They weren't actively doing the motions of digesting the food, so they were storing that food in their throat for a long period of time, causing these infections. That's number one. Still happens now, but not as often, and it happens even less now with Dunners that are not crossbred. So obviously, we always say don't do Dunner to Dunner because there's no benefit in doing it, because you still get Dunners in the clutch with only one Dunner parent. If you have two Dunner parents, you're still going to get normals, just not as many. It's not really necessary to do it that way. So just do one parent with Dunner, and this will obviously keep spreading the lines. The other thing that we experienced back then were crinkle toes. I don't have any pictures of crinkle toes. I'll try to look on Google and see if I can find some and post them on the video while I'm talking about them. But crinkle toes was something people thought just because it's a Dunner, it's always going to have crinkle toes. Crinkle toes, essentially, it sounds exactly what it is. Crinkle fries where they have zigzags, that's exactly what the toes looked like. Every time the joint was, the toe would zigzag, and essentially it looked really creepy, and they called it crinkle toes as well. So zigzag toes, crinkle toes, whatever you want to call them, that's what they looked like, and hopefully I have a picture that I can show you guys. The other thing that happened is people seem to believe that Dunners were shorter, stockier bearded dragons. So they thought that they were not as long, they were wider, and all of these things. This was also caused by inbreeding and line breeding. It was not necessarily true. After several generations of outbreeding or outcrossing, the Dunners were all the same size as regular bearded dragons, and they never actually had wider tails or wider bodies or anything like that. It was just the way it was back then. So they all have the same bodies as everybody else. That's a false statement people used to say. It wasn't necessary. I actually had, in my 13 years, it's almost 13, or no, I started keeping bearded dragons in 2011. It's 14 years now. Wow. And I started breeding them in 2013, or 2012? 2013 is when I started breeding them. But that is a long time that I've had bearded dragons, and I've always had Dunners. It was probably my 5th bearded dragon, I had a leatherback, and my 6th bearded dragon, I had a Dunner. It was love at first sight. I was like, this is wacky. This is the best looking thing I've ever seen in my life. I love it. And I've never not had Dunners since, unless I didn't have bearded dragons in general. So, and that only happened for like 2 years. So it was not a long time. And I've always had Dunners. I've always had leatherbacks. I love both of them. They're the best things. So I've never ever seen a bearded dragon, just because it was a Dunner, be shorter than the other bearded dragons. I have seen translucents be shorter, and that's because of breeding. But that's the only morph I know that actually gets stunted growth based off the morph. And that's, I mean, the chances of that even happening in translucent is very slim right now. It's all based off how often that line was outcrossed, with that translucent line was outcrossed. With Dunners, it doesn't really happen. It never really happened. It was just a false statement people believed because they saw a Dunner and they probably didn't get to see all of the other range of animals as well. So with Dunners, these were founded by Kevin Dunn or Dragon Den's Herp. Kevin founded the Dunners. So he didn't necessarily find the Dunners. There were a few breeders out there. There was two breeders out there. What was it? South something ranch, Southwestern ranch or something like that. And they were trying to figure out what it was, but it also they sold some to Kevin, or Kevin had some in his line as well. And then eventually Dunners were created, but Kevin obviously coined the term because the other people are still trying to figure out what they were. So Kevin Dunn created the Dunners, obviously in the name there. And that was a long time ago, and he's still around now. Dragon Den Herp, if you want to look him up, he does more than just Dunners, obviously, but all he does is red bearded dragons, if you're into that. I used to have a bunch of dragons from Kevin. I think as of right now, I don't have any. All of my reds, like this male here, I don't know if you guys can see him. He is from Kevin Dunn lines. And I think the two females that wherever they may be, I think they're right behind me, they're also from Kevin Dunn lines. They're not from Kevin Dunn, but they're from Kevin Dunn lines. So his lines run very far. They're everywhere because he's been around a long time. So the other thing about Dunners is people think that Dunner is a pattern morph. It's not necessarily a pattern morph. Even the morph does change the pattern. The Dunner morph is actually a scale changing morph. And that's how the pattern gets changed, because now the scales, instead of being flat and going downwards down the body, they are now conical and point upward. So they're like a cone shape, ice cream cone shape, and they point upward. So that actually changes the pattern as well in the bearded dragon. So they're not necessarily a pattern morph, but the morph itself does change the pattern. And I think that's mainly everything about Dunners. That's the story. That's the history. It's not really a long one. That's just what happened, and that's how it came to be. And nobody really breeds Dunner to Dunner because people don't want to deal with any of the bad effects from back then. I used to have some crinkle toe bearded dragons, and so creepy. And I knew that it wasn't supposed to be. Even everyone that I talked to about it, they were like, "No, that's not right." But it was everywhere. They were everywhere, not even just in Dunners. Honestly, I said that it happened in Dunners a lot, but it happened in a lot of other bearded dragons as well because of inbreeding. And those crinkle toes, they run far. You have to do a lot of outcrossing to get those crinkle toes bred out of bearded dragons. Like, I think the last crinkle toe bearded dragon that I saw was probably one of the dragons that I owned about 2 years ago, Peaches, and it wasn't even that bad. It was just one crink in the toe, and I'm like, it's still around. Congratulations. But that's essentially everything that I have about Dunners. And with that said, if you made it this far into the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss anything that I put out in the future. As always, peace.